Now it's my pleasure to introduce again Ann Moss Rogers, who will serve as our presenter today. Ann Moss is a motivational mental health TED Talk speaker, author, suicide prevention trainer, and suicide loss survivor. Through her own experience of loss, Ann Moss uses her authenticity and know-how to teach and support others. Now, as an expert on emotional wellness, suicide prevention, and postvention, as well as youth mental health, she speaks at conferences, universities, schools, and workplaces to help better equip her audiences, fill their hearts with hope, and ultimately save lives. Let's welcome again Ann Moss Rogers.
Thank you so much, Jay. I appreciate that. And thank you all for being here today for addiction and the tragic link to suicide, awareness and prevention strategies for schools. As always, I like to bring up the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline and the Crisis Text Line, simply because we're going to be talking about some very emotional subjects today. And thank you all for putting in where you're from, and keep that chat going. It allows me to understand you're still there, and because otherwise I'm not seeing you. So thank you for that. So this is my son, Charles. And he was the funniest, most popular kid in school. And here he's being escorted as a sophomore on homecoming court by his favorite teacher, Miss Fretwell. And he struggled. He always had a lot of things going on from the time he was born to the time he was in high school. Little quirks that, because he was a creative genius. So, yeah, and then he had all the stuff that went with that. But by the time he got to high school, I saw some things that were alarming me. And I would realize later that it was major depression. But for somebody so funny and outwardly always smiling, that was difficult to see. But it wasn't long after this picture was taken that Charles's drug use started to escalate. And I didn't understand why, because we had had this conversation. And what I realize now is that he was using drugs and alcohol to numb thoughts of suicide, because to him, wasn't that better than killing himself? So in that moment, he felt like, well, you know, it's definitely worth it. And mom would rather me do that. But I didn't know. And I never knew. And it wasn't until his death by suicide in 2015 that I would find all this out. So he starts using drugs and alcohol, and I would read his lyrics later, and I thought this was very telling. I keep my sadness masked with a flask. I got sorry to borrow. I'm hollow. I wasn't ever aware of the level of self-awareness that Charles had. I was never really aware of the shame he felt for using drugs and alcohol, even well before he became addicted years later. We went to a counselor because we were struggling to figure out what to do, because he started taking some really alarming risks. And risk taking is a trait and a risk factor both for suicide and substance use disorder. And I didn't know it was a risk factor for suicide at the time, but I did know it was for substance use disorder. We're seeing a counselor, and I asked for a psychological evaluation. No, I didn't. I asked for a diagnosis. I didn't ask for the official psychological evaluation. So I asked him for a diagnosis, and he goes, oh, we don't need that. Charles doesn't have depression. But he would end up recommended that we send our son to a wilderness program. And that's not something you do because you caught your kid with a beer and a joint, right? That's something you do because you think your child's life is truly at risk. It's a desperate move. We had utilized all local resources by this time. And so we weren't getting the results that we needed to see. And I can't tell you that this was the greatest move on earth. It was just the only one that I knew of, and it was the one being recommended. And as you can tell from the picture, I'll make it bigger. Charles was not excited about it. And who would be? You know, basically you're being deposited in the woods in the middle of April in Georgia with no electronics, and you have to go to the bathroom by digging a hole in the dirt. All mail that we got from Charles at this point was smoking mad. But this is where we finally got a psychological evaluation. Unfortunately, this was a $32,000 move. We didn't have that kind of money lying around. I happened to have a savings account that I had been tucking away money for about 10 years for kitchen renovation, which all went in 10 weeks for him in this wilderness therapy program. But this is where we finally got a psychological evaluation. They told us that he had major depression. That was really hard for me to understand because I wasn't seeing it, but I did believe it. I always waffled back and forth with it. Anxiety, which we knew about, ADHD, which we already knew about. Charles had a sleep disorder called delayed sleep phase syndrome, which I believe played into all of his issues. But they also listed something I'd never heard of, cannabis dependence. He had started using marijuana in order to self-medicate. What I saw is that it made his anxiety worse. Of course, he didn't see that. Before he was sent off, there'd be one night I would hear somebody out on the roof freaking me out. And then I'm like, well, they can't come through my window, but they can come through the guest room window. And I go and I peer through the window, and there is my 6'2", 135-pound child, naked in 22 degrees, peeing off the edge of the roof. And I'm freaking out. I'm like, what is going on? We end up taking him to the hospital that night because I know he's under the influence of some, I don't know what it is. It's scaring me to death. And it turned out in the toxicology report that it was marijuana. It had triggered a psychosis. And so he was just totally out of his mind. So that was one of the incidents that led up to us taking this step. From there, they recommended he go to therapeutic boarding school. Another step we couldn't afford either, but our home equity loan could. So that's what funded that step. And a small 401k that I had from working at an advertising agency. He would come home in 2015, having spent about 22 months outside our home in some kind of placement. It was my hope, and I didn't think everything was going to be perfect and fixed simply because he went away and he came back. We had done some family therapy, but unlike today's kind of family-based treatment, I don't think we got enough of that so that we were educated in how to manage him coming back home. So I don't really think there's ever enough education for parents in that step when they're coming back from, say, psychiatric placement, rehab, or any of these wilderness programs. So Charles goes back to using drugs and alcohol to manage his problems, like right away. I don't know that. And it ends up graduating into a heroin addiction. I don't know that either for like 10 months. And it wasn't until like a week before his death that I even knew it was heroin, because once he went to rehab and detox, there's HIPAA and they don't tell you anything. So I thought it was opiates, maybe, but I was never really sure. And that I wasn't able to get educated because of that. Because I'm like, well, it may be an opiate, because he said he might be addicted to an opiate. And I was naive enough to think that it was a pill and not like heroin. He wasn't injecting it. So we had a rule in our house that you couldn't do drugs in the house. So what he would do is he would go out to his car parked in front of the house. He would text his drug dealer. He would wait in the car. The drug dealer would come at 3 a.m. when we're sleeping. He would deliver it in the window. You know, he'd roll down the window. Charles would buy and pay for the drugs, and he would snort it in the car. I didn't even know you could snort heroin. All of this was unknown to me until much later. And then he would go back in the house and he would sleep it off. And by the time I saw him, I didn't always see a normal person, but for the most part, the most difficult part of the drug, or the part that I might have recognized, was happening while I was sleeping. So he would finally confess to the drug and alcohol use. And how that happened is somebody came by the house with a picture of him selling our family silver in a pawn shop. So he would come home that day from pet sitting. And this is one of the conversations I handled really well. I didn't handle all of them well, but I handled this one really well. And I told him that the police officers had come by and they had showed me these pictures. And did he want to share why he was selling the family silver, and that I suspected some drug use? He would go and tell me this wild and crazy story. And I listened to the story, but I did something I didn't ordinarily do. I just kept my mouth shut. There's a lot of good stuff that happens when we're quiet and let them process their thoughts. And he goes, Mom, do you believe me? And I just said, Charles, that is some story. And I just shook my head and I did it again. I let that silence just sit there. He wasn't used to that. He was used to me filling it in, asking more questions, giving advice. And then he would confess to he thought he might be addicted to an opiate. He taught the rehab. He went to a recovery house and he would relapse within 24 hours. It was their protocol to have the house manager take him through the process to put him back into detox, which he only had to do for 3 days. And at this point, he'd only done one hit. Part of that process was taking him to the psych hospital for a suicide risk evaluation, because that manager of the recovery house knew it was a risk. I had no idea. And, you know, of course, I agreed. Definitely, we have the insurance. But when he was taken there, he was turned down because they didn't screen those people anymore, meaning people who had substance use disorder. That made my son feel like human garbage. He would go back to detox. He'd be all checked in. We're all relieved. Oh, this nightmare is finally, this chapter is finally over. But he saw a friend and he walked out. And for 2 weeks, we didn't know where he was. We'd get the occasional text. I had a last phone call I didn't know was my last phone call, because one of the things that people don't realize is that when someone with substance use disorder is asking for help, it's usually pretty ugly. There's a lot of yelling, and he was going through withdrawal, making it that much more difficult to understand him. And of course, I didn't know he was going through withdrawal. My demon's up against me, and I'm facing them now. I wear the face of a clown. I feel so unloved because of the monster created from drugs. that was from his music lyrics that I never read until after he died, but it really described how the shame, the level of shame my son felt. He would post this on social media with a series of other posts. If I died, no one would notice for at least a month. His last one would say, "Death sounds nice." I thought, oh, I need to wait till rock bottom. But lots of times we just need to intervene. We need to be the rock bottom. But I didn't know where he was, and I just really didn't know what to do. And I didn't see these messages until really about an hour before our last phone call, and probably 3 hours before he died. We were in a restaurant eating dinner when we got a call from the police who said they wanted to meet us in the parking lot. And at first I thought, oh my gosh, he's been arrested. This is great. And then I thought, well, why would the city police come to our house in the county to tell us our 20-year-old is in jail? They don't do that. And then they delivered the worst news of our lives and told us that they had found our son dead that morning. In the midst of the wailing and screaming and crying, the police officer, my husband would ask the police officer, well, how did he die? And my husband and the police officer said it was a suicide, and the method left no question. My first thought, how could I be such an awful mother that my child would check out on me? And it had it in my brain, it was overdose. And I didn't understand the relationship between suicide and substance use disorder. No one had ever told me it was a risk. I now know that those with alcohol dependence or use drugs have 10 to 14 times greater risk of a death by suicide. Add in his diagnosis of depression, you have an even greater risk. And it's really, there are not as many studies on this as I would have thought, the relationship between the two. And that's why they take shoestrings when people check into psych or rehab. They'll take drawstrings and they'll take shoestrings. And that's because they don't want people to die by asphyxiation. I would go on to write this article for the newspaper, and it took me like 6 months to write 1,200 words. And I would talk about the addiction, his mental illness, and his death by suicide, because I decided I was going to speak out on this subject. It took me 6 months. It felt so good writing it. It felt great turning it in. But when it came out, I nearly had a panic attack because I was sharing my whole ugly family story to the world. But this one went viral. And because other people were living the same story or some piece of it. I would go on to write this on my blog not long before the first death anniversary. Basically, it details how we got the news and how we reacted to it. Who would want to read that? And I felt really guilty for hitting publish. I wrote it at midnight. I'm crying so much, my t-shirt, but it actually felt good to get it out there. And I didn't know why I wrote it, and I didn't know if anybody would read it. And then hundreds of thousands of people came and read that article and put comments, and I would get notes from people. I owned a digital marketing company at the time. So what I recognize is that people go to Google when they want to find out ways to die. How could I take my son's method of death do a how-to article and get people to my page where I wouldn't give directions, but I would offer hope and resources. So I wrote that article. First, I got just a little bit of traction, but not much. So I put a video up there, and I'm going to share this video with you. It's 56 seconds. I made it myself. It is not a work of art. Hold on. Trying to unshare something and share something new.
Oh hey, I'm Tide Pennysickle.
Whew. That one was a tough one for me to watch today. That's what I on that 2-page, and it had a cringeworthy title. And then I got my first message, and it came from a young man who had been addicted to heroin and was in recovery. And now that he was in recovery, he wasn't being treated for his mental illness, depression. He spent 14 hours on the site, and this was part of his message. You had changed the way I think of my ideation. Today, I'm okay enough to want to try and fight another day. This is the first of thousands of comments that I've gotten over the years. And it really was a turning point that inspired me to do what I do. So I sold my digital marketing business, and I got trained, and I decided I was going to use my lived experience and training and work with researchers so that I could have that all-around view of what the link between substance use disorder and suicide was. So we're going to talk a little about substance use disorder and risk. So I'm going to have a little question, and if everybody would put their answer in the chat. Cannabis or marijuana is associated with severity of major depression and suicidality for teens 13 to 18 years old. True, true, true. I knew it. You guys know. I was telling them earlier that when it comes to knowledge, my school counselors, they're always the ones who have the answer. So thanks for that. And I have a few of these throughout. So when are young people with substance use disorder most vulnerable to suicide? Well, this is true whether they have substance use disorder or not, but I'm going to be talking to these points as it relates to these two things. So when we talk about transitions, I work with NC State University a lot, and I had called them last year, or a year and a half ago. They had like 12 suicides in 1 year, and unfortunately, it was all over CNN, and they were becoming known as, the suicide college. Well, this was happening in a lot of other universities. It was just being publicized more there. And I said, you have a mini transition coming up when the kids come back to the campus after spring break. And we talked about ways they can mitigate that potential transition. And they had an overdose. They had a suicide once they got back, but they also had an overdose. So it is those transitions during the school year from like graduation's a big one, but we have the ones just leaving for summer break or coming back, leaving for holidays and coming back. Those transitions are times where kids are going to feel more, depressed, more anxious. So it's a heightened time for potential overdose. It's a heightened time for suicide risk. The other is relationship disruption. And when I say relationship disruption, I mean romantic breakups, fight with a parent, fight with a friend. Grief and loss is a big one. And I find that grief and loss is a big catalyst for both self-harm and substance misuse. A lot of males in particular want to numb their feelings when they have some kind of grief event in their life. And that kicks off a substance use disorder for a lot of people. So let's say my risk or your risk might be about 10% as an adult. But kids under the age of 25, it's about double that. And we don't know who is predisposed to be having substance use disorder. So we know that peak intentional overdose deaths peak in the spring through the summer and on Mondays. So a lot of people think it's the holidays. But it's interesting that it's on Mondays, and a lot of people think it's because, they have a lot of connection on the weekends. And by Monday, it doesn't feel like that anymore. Intentional overdose increased most steeply among the youngest, 15 to 24. So it actually went down, but it went up for this population. And as a note, it's gone up for the oldest generation and Black women. This is another time we don't really talk about being a risk for suicide, and that's withdrawal. Going in and out of rehab, that's a big transition. Charles had sent me this text message. I cried a lot before the hospital, and in the hospital, withdrawal made me feel so alone. I was left with nothing but the guilt of my actions. I remember reading that text over and over and feeling some sense of dread, or there was more in there than I knew, but he never came outright and told me. So when he actually did die by suicide, he was going through withdrawal. So that was a catalyst for him. So why do the addicted take their lives? Shame. A lot of us, or a lot of people, think that we can shame them into recovery. Well, we can't do that. Abandonment by the family. It may not be that we're really abandoning them, but using that sort of tough love, and people thought, well, I've tried everything else, I need to try this. But what we're doing is really kind of weaponizing our love. Pain from withdrawal, grief, disciplinary or criminal justice issues, relationship losses, hopelessness, feelings of failure, mental health issues not being addressed, and poor physical health. Charles had all of these except for grief. He had lost a relationship, but he hadn't lost somebody. He hadn't lost anybody to death. So I wanted to take this opportunity to put the link to some of the resources. And There's lots of them because I have a tendency to put a lot of resources. One is resources for family of the addicted. One is signs and symptoms of the latest drug trends, which would be probably more relevant to this crowd because you may not have that many people with opioid use disorder in high school, although they're more than you think. But they're kind of experimenting with more of those marijuana, vaping, and other trending substances. So we're going to talk about suicide intent because we often don't know if an intentional overdose is intentional unless there are mitigating factors. So researchers estimate from 4 to 25% of overdoses might be suicides. What that says is we don't really know. And it depends on what study you read, but intent is really difficult to see after the fact. So one way we might be able to see it is if they leave a suicide note. Then we know that that intentional overdose, that overdose was intentional and not accidental. Usually your officers, your criminal justice system, your coroner is going to opt for accidental unless there is proof otherwise. So if somebody is in an accident and there are skid marks, then they say, okay, that's an accident. But if there's an accident where somebody, like went off a bridge and there were no skid marks, they might rule that as a suicide. So again, there's a lot of investigation that goes into, is this accidental or intentional? And when somebody has substance use disorder, it's really hard to tell. So this is a friend of mine's son, Mike Stewart. And he struggled with substance use disorder. He went to school with my son, Charles. And he was finally in rehab and he relapsed. And when they take that dose after relapsing, well, what happens is their body isn't used to it. And he ends up going in front of traffic and a truck runs him over. And we don't know if it's on purpose. He had been suicidal before. Or was this a drug-related death because he was high? We don't really know. His mother assumes that it probably was a suicide, but she doesn't know if it was intentional or not. So that's where that fuzziness is. There's another story of a child named Darren. I met his mom at one of these addiction conferences, and she told me her son died of accidental overdose. Later, I would be at an event and her husband would come up to me and say, I don't think Darren died of accidental overdose. And I said, well, what are you thinking? And he described the last scenario. He said that he was sitting in a car, dropping his son off at the Kroger to his job. And then his son Darren turned around and said, hey, Dad, I want you to have these, and gave away his prized possession, his CD collection, back when that was a prized collection. And his dad said it felt really weird. And he says, as he was walking into Kroger, he wondered, is this the last time I'm going to see my son? And he got a call 2 hours later that his son had overdosed in the bathroom of the Kroger. He told me he thought his son died by suicide and it was an intentional overdose, but he did not ever want me to share that with his wife, which I never have. But again, that's that murkiness, and they ruled it an accidental overdose because they didn't have any of that information. Plus, the dad didn't want the mom to know that it could have been a suicide. This is what I saw. My son's didn't die of an intentional overdose. The method left no question. He didn't leave a note, but it's a method of suicide that, was just really obvious. So there were no questions about that. So up until now, oh, you're welcome about the resources. Does anybody have any questions up till now? Thank you for telling your stories in the chat, by the way. So if you've got any kind of relatable stories, because I read these chats, if I don't read it during the presentation, I will pour over it later. But I did want to take this pause if anyone had any questions up until now. Okay, I will move on. So we're going to look at drug information and some of the emerging substances. This could be a whole presentation in and of itself, but this is probably very relatable to this audience. And we're going to start with a question. Nicotine, vaping nicotine, can affect the user's mental health by causing A, night terrors, B, increased rates of depression, C, trigeminal neuralgia, or D, all of the above. All right, I'll give you a second, put in your answers. I have to admit to wanting to get y'all on this one. I put in the trigeminal neuralgia because I'm a brain tumor survivor and I know what that is. But it is increased rates of depression. That's what the research says. So thank you for participating in that. We know that alcohol use disorder and opioid use disorder are the two most frequently implicated substance and suicide risk. We have far more people dying of alcohol use disorder, but there's something about the opiates that affects the brain receptors in such a way that makes people feel more hopeless. I mean, addiction in and of itself feeds into that low self-esteem, that helplessness, that lack of connection. But for some reason, it really pushes people in really towards wanting to die by suicide. It is such a difficult rehab. So alcohol use disorder, you may have somebody go to rehab, and there are exceptions, of course, but average 1 to 2 times. With opioid use disorder, it's 5 to 6 times. A lot of families just can't afford that, and they get tired of it too. So that's probably part of the issue. This is still big we find it mostly in high school seniors, especially before they take the SAT or the PSAT. We find it a lot on college campuses. So what do you think is in that Adderall? You may say, a stimulant. We have a lot of counterfeit pills out there. So fentanyl could be in there, cement, arsenic, and something called xylazine, which is also known as tranq, is often put in the counterfeit renditions of this. And of course, it's not a study aid. But this one tends to strip people of their resilience, even people who've had resilience. And this can drive people towards suicide if they get in the habit of using it. Because if this becomes their go-to to manage their schedule, they ditch everything else, and this becomes their go-to. We also have kids still getting oxycodone for wisdom teeth removal. I actually educate kids to tell the oral surgeon they don't need that. And I've had them come back and say, I told my oral surgeon I wasn't going to take it, and they needed to shred the prescription. So I've made the kids champions because they have a 20% chance of getting addicted when they have wisdom teeth removal. And what's more, the kids in high school will find out who's having their wisdom teeth taken out, and they'll kind of stalk those kids and try to pressure them into selling them. And they do that a lot through social media messages as well. My son did it. He found out his friend Jacob was having his wisdom teeth removed and wanted to know if he had any juicy leftovers. So while we've tried to educate our oral surgeons, they're still handing this out. And I will tell you that what works in oxycodone is the analgesic, which is better known as Tylenol. And if you do Tylenol and Advil, but we really need to start educating the kids about this. We need to educate the parents about this. So how many of you have seen a bunch of these sort of convenience stores with lights around? And if you put in the chat, if you've seen any of these, they're smoke shops or convenience stores. They have hookah, CBD, kratom written on the outside. So if you've seen any of those in your area, let me know. We have the cutest part of Richmond, Virginia called Carytown. We now have 5, and it lasts maybe 4 blocks. We have 5 of these in Carytown. And the reason is it's right beside a college campus. This one in this picture is right across the street from a school. And I found packages on the ground in front of the school. And I don't think it was an elementary school. So I don't actually think the elementary students were using it, but they're still being exposed to the packaging. So here are some things that I have found, and this is not exhaustive. Kratom, it acts like an opiate. So the symptoms are similar, and they can die and overdose from this substance. This is a bag of 1,500 pills. And what's circled there is the word organic. So you don't have to worry because it's organic. It is addictive, it is dangerous, and it's under the radar. And almost anybody can go in and buy this. I asked about how old you have to be. They said 21, but I saw several people come in. None of them looked 21. No one was getting carded. This is something called Amanita muscaria. And what that is, it is a hallucinogen. And we're seeing it in elementary schools now because it's also in the form of gummy bears. So what is Amanita muscaria? It is a hallucinogen, kind of like shrooms. You may have heard of psilocybin. Now take a look at that packaging. Let me know in the chat. Do you think this is being marketed to adults or kids? What are your thoughts? Cookies and cream. Mushroom chocolate. Both kids, right. I mean, this packaging is clearly not being marketed to me. So what are these addictive substances labeled as? Mood enhancer, dietary supplement, focus aid, sleep aid. This generation wants to numb their feelings instead of feeling their feelings. And I think it's really important that kids understand they need to feel their feelings, that there's nothing wrong with that they're temporary, that the intense feelings, the really hard ones, last 60 to 90 seconds. But instead they want to numb them. And so these substances are one way they manage their difficult days and moods. Legal, and most of these substances are under the radar and they're legal. But legal does not mean safe. They are deadly, they are addictive, and they can lead to fentanyl use. They can lead, to nowhere. And people can die just by using some of these from your local convenience stores. But make no mistake about it, the new gateway drug isn't a drug, but a drug delivery instrument. How many of you all have seen vape pens in schools? They fit in the palm of their hand. Here's the issue with the vape pen. It used to be $35, $50. There's still vape pens or e-cigarettes that are that much. They're now under $10 and they're very available. If you go into these convenience stores, the first thing that will hit you is this wall of vapes. And that leads to addiction, because what's happening is people are seeing money in this and they are doing everything they can to get their drug to go in a vape pen, because we don't know what's in that vape pen. And it's really hard. And probably Jay could tell you this, and your other SROs. It's really hard to know what's in there without sending it off to a lab. Reaching out for a substance to solve a problem robbed my son of the ability to develop healthy coping strategies. That's what drugs do. Once that becomes their go-to, they don't develop other strategies. So I think it's really important that we work now in schools to focus on developing those healthy coping skills, because they're not getting them like they used to out on the playground, so to speak. So test your knowledge. Marijuana is not physically addictive, true or false? I'll give you another second. I'll play the music. Do 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 do. Okay, I'm going to reveal the answer. I think everybody got it right. False. Marijuana, especially those under 25, can be very physically addicted. And long-term use, they'll do something called scromiting, which is screaming and vomiting at the same time. So not only is there the marijuana that is, it's in all forms, but it's also in those dabs, those yellow waxy, and those are called high THC concentrates. And those are even more addictive and more likely to trigger psychosis. And we know that the number one substance of teenagers who have died by suicide in Colorado is now marijuana. So we're starting to see a trend of those states where it's legalized, seeing it in the toxicology reports of our young people. The resources again, and I'll make that bigger. And I'm going to put the link in the chat. And this game I'm playing is also included in those resources. So there are a lot of them. You can cut them up in squares and put them in a bag. And I use them in my workshops. So I decided I would share that with you all. Any questions up until now? I'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, moving on. So what can we do? Educate families, vaping, drug trends, and craft. Craft is actually basically one of the few methodologies of managing it from a family standpoint. In other words, we're not going to shame them out of their addiction, but it gives families other strategies to use. I think screening for suicide risk always at doctor's appointments, ERs. What about the sports physical? I think all rehab should screen for suicide risk. I think we need to treat mental health issues at the same time we treat substance use disorders. So what happened with my son is that I would take him to a psychiatrist and they're like, oh, well, we can't even discuss any of this because you need to fix that drug problem he has first. I didn't realize my son was struggling with thoughts of suicide. So that psychiatrist basically telling my son, you know, put those suicidal thoughts on hold. We'll get to those after you fix this other issue, which was the reason he was having it in the first place. There's this sort of siloed approach. And the first thing people go to when they're struggling lots of times is a substance that's kind of become normalized. And when that happens, a certain percentage of those people become addicted. We need to train our school nurses, coaches, plus the other staff. Our coaches really could spot people at risk. And our school nurses, you know, kids who come in with mental health problems or, you know, or fevers, headaches, those kids are having mental health problems. And some of them we're seeing as a result of using some kind of substance. Here's one that I think is really important. Help students with impulsivity, substance use disorder, and suicide risk. Impulsivity is a factor in both of those. And I'll have some ideas on that. This is one way to educate and get the kids involved. It is a program called Hidden in Plain Sight. I wish I had like a link for this. You may have already done it in your area. If you have, let me know in the chat. But it is where they come and they set up a trailer like a teenager's room, and you're supposed to go in with a notepad and write down all the things you think might indicate drug use. What I love about this is it gets the kids involved. They like being a part of this, promoting it, and all the ones I've been to, they've been on site. So it's a way to kind of educate them at the same time you're educating parents. Screening, I always advocate for the Ask Suicide Screening tool. It takes about 20 seconds to do, and it's from the National Institute of Mental Health. So we want to prevent students from getting to crisis. So we really have the same steps for substance use disorder as we do for suicide prevention as we do for both. Build connection and belonging, build coping skills, and we want to focus on the impulsivity, promote help seeking as a sign of strength. There are a lot of things we can do, but if we concentrated on those three, we would get a long way. So I've got another question, and I know you're going to get this one right. Helping kids and adults with all impulse control can help prevent substance use disorder, suicide, and may even help prevent substance use disorder relapse. True or false? True, you all got it. No surprise there. So I have been working with Dr. Jasmine Vasilova at the Institute of Drug and Alcohol Studies, and we're awaiting a grant on building an app where you can play games so people can learn inhibitory control and other skills that will prevent substance use disorder or help people in recovery learn those skills. One of those games is called Screw. It's the one where you suppress the urge to say the word and instead name the color. So the first one says yellow, but you would say red because it's the color of red. Other games that build this skill are Simon Says and Red Light, Green Light. So it's sort of a delayed gratification game. Again, that builds that skill of builds inhibitory control. There we go. So I want to ask you all, what magic skill is the foundation of all mental health strategies? The pause. We need to teach kids to take that deep breath, to stop for a minute before they react. So a lot of people say mindfulness. Well, we can't do mindfulness if we can't get them to take the pause and stop first. And one way to illustrate this is I played this game, and I'm not gonna play this YouTube video. It's 10 seconds. So I'm gonna give you the link to the video. And I actually make these snow globes with the kids. And the whole point of it is you shake it up and all the little things are all around. And the tsunami of emotions, that is not the right time to react or to act on something. You got to wait till your mind settles first before you can make a really informed decision. So that snow globe is a way to kind of illustrate that point. I've done this with elementary school students. I've done it with adults. At first I thought, oh, it's a kid activity. I was wrong. I've done it with all age groups now. This has been a really popular one. It started with second grade, but it's been really popular with some older students too. And I'm going to give you the links to those as well. And I give Wendy Turner credit for this. So what she does in her classroom is she has kids come in and put a bracelet that represents how they feel that day: angry, happy, neutral. And they can go in the middle of class and they can change them. So what she was teaching one day, and she got interrupted like 3 times by the same person, and it made her mad. The third time, she's starting to get really angry. And so she goes and she rips off her green bracelet, she puts it in the bucket, and she takes a red one and she puts it on her wrist, and she goes in the corner and she starts deep breathing. All the time they're watching her. And she said, I need a minute to bring my emotions down. Then she turns back around once she's kind of calmed down, and she looked at her students and she said, what just happened there? And it opened up a discussion about how she was angry, how she reacted, and how she took some deep breaths to bring her emotion down before she started teaching again. And then I have the sound one. So I'm going to share a screen. And this is a game that teachers can play, or that I have played in workshops. Sound one. Sound two. For obvious reasons, that last one gets a lot of laughs simply because they're not expecting you, the adult, to play a part. What happens is everyone in the class laughs. And that laugh creates that moment of connection. So even showing a funny video does the trick. But then you can open up the discussion about how sounds or how smells or certain senses can start to stir up emotions. And then you can start to say, well, how would you use a healthy coping strategy to manage that feeling? So those are just a couple examples of different games. Now here's the bonus section. And this is for all of you because you sit through so many trainings, and this is to you mostly from a parent point of view. You can take a lot of these strategies and apply it to students, but since you sit through so many trainings, I thought you deserve this because this is one of the most popular parts of one of my parent trainings. And it is teaching resilience, basically. So we've kind of got kids today who don't really react well to being punished. And we're kind of in this still punitive state where we want to punish, but I think we need to really start to migrate from punitive parenting to wisdom guide, simply because that punitive strategy just really isn't working for this generation of kids. And I've got some examples of what I mean. So we need to listen more and lecture less. When has lecturing ever worked in the history of mankind? Like never. And I think that one of the things that I learned is in those stretches of silence is when the gold really happens. I've also learned, like with my older son, that taking a walk with him, he will start to talk more because we're doing something active and he's not looking at not looking at me face to face. He is a strong introvert, and when we take a walk, he doesn't shut up the moment we start, and it's absolutely, I just love it. And as a result of that, even now when he gets on the phone, it's like he's created a habit. He'll talk to me more, he'll tell me more, he shares more. So back when my kids were little, Charles was actually at the therapeutic boarding school when I started this. But right before he left, I said, I'm not going to lecture anymore. They die laughing. You are. You're always going to lecture. No, I'm not. And y'all are going to help me. And they were confused. And I said, anytime I lecture, you're going to call me on it. And you're going to say, Mom, that's unsolicited advice. And then you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to shut up. I'm going to say thank you. And I'm not going to do it anymore. Well, it takes 18 months to break a habit, but with their help, within 6 weeks, I had broken this habit. I've never lectured again. What do you do instead? Well, you want to allow them to feel heard without fixing. We ask more questions because this builds problem-solving skills. They may not answer you when you ask a question, but I can guarantee you they will think about it. We want to ask with curiosity and not accusation. So I'll give you an example. My son was moving to LA. Yes, I'm going to cry all over again because he is a coast away. I live in Virginia. LA's way too far. But anyway, it's his life, right? And I'm sitting there in my head because he's telling me he's going to haul all his stuff to California. He's going to be couch surfing when he first gets there. So I don't point that out to him because what's he going to do? Dig his heels in. So instead, I let him tell me about how he's going to get out there. And I said, I have a question. And he goes, what? I said, once you get there, where are you going to put all your stuff? You said you were couch surfing. I said, you don't have to answer it now. I was just curious. And then I said, well, also, how much is it to have all that hauled? And then I said, you know what? I'm not worried about that at all. You're really smart. You'll figure this out. So again, I'm giving him the confidence that I know he's going to figure this out. 2 weeks later, he calls me back. Mom, do you know how much it is to haul our stuff all the way to California? And then once I get there, there's nowhere to put it. You don't say. So again, I just asked questions. I didn't give him the answers. I let him arrive at the answers himself. And when they are invested in that way, they're more likely to do it that way. Be vulnerable, but don't overshare, because we can't expect them to open up if we don't first. So if we're asking them, well, I ask my child all the time how he's feeling, but if you've never shared, they're unlikely to open up themselves. I don't have a feeling that this group is like this, but it is just good to know that it's really important to say, I have a presentation at work today. I am really nervous. What do you think I should do? Sort of basically saying, I am listening to you. Help me resolve this issue. Don't cheerlead them out of the blues. Meet them where they are. It is so tempting as a parent when somebody comes home and says, oh, everyone says I'm ugly. And you're dying to say, no, you're beautiful. It's better to say, why do you think everyone thinks you're ugly? And let them talk about it first, because when we just push that toxic positivity on them, they shut down and they don't tell you the whole story. And if we want to know the whole story, we have to be willing to listen. And we want so badly to say how wonderful they look and how beautiful they are, when what we really need to be doing is listening. We want to give them power, because they're in a place and in a generation where they don't feel they have much power, or they don't feel seen and they don't feel heard. So I'm going to tell you a brief story. And my friend Jen was going back to work, and I'm going to make that bigger again. She was going back to work as a nurse after the pandemic. And so she was really, really anxious about it. And I said, get your kids to help. And she said, they're 9 and 11. What can they do? And I said, for one, they can come and give you a random hug. And so she told them, and they came and gave her a random hug. And she said it was like, it was so tense. And then she just loosened up, and she said they felt it. That was one way she gave them their power back. Well, they took it a step further. She said how nervous she was about starting this new job. So what they did was, for 2 weeks, they took turns putting a note in their mother's lunch. Hi, Mom, it's me again with another note. How was your second day? I hope it was awesome. So she gets these surprise notes every day in her lunch. Do you think she feels anxious anymore? No. So she was able to come home and tell her kids how much they meant. Again, giving them their power back, allowing them to understand that they make a difference, that they have a purpose. Understand their fears. So I have an example for this one. You've made a psychiatrist appointment. It took you 6 months to get this psychiatrist appointment. You filled out a mountain of paperwork, and the day of, that child comes to you and says, I don't want to go. First reaction you want to do is, oh yeah, you are going. If I have to tie you to the seat, blah, 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 blah. Chill out, take a deep breath. Let's find out where that fear is coming from. So why do you not want to go to the psychiatrist? What are your fears around that? I'm willing to listen because I'd like to know. Well, I know they're going to prescribe something that makes me a zombie. Huh, you as a mother. Well, I wouldn't want that either. That's a really good question. I have an idea. Can we write down some of these questions and maybe you ask them? And then they become engaged and interested again. And then I'll make you a deal. I am not going to make you do any treatment that you're not willing to do. But I've got a lot of questions. And since we have the appointment, I'd like to get the answers to them. What about you? If you find out what their fears are, you've got something to work with. Finally, and we have a lot of parents that do this, I doubt parents on the call, allowing for failure. Just because they fail a test doesn't mean they're going to end up living in a ditch, never going to college. And especially with the bullying thing, I see so many parents, I'm going to go tell them at the school that this can't happen. And then I usually tell the parents, I'm like, well, is any of this bullying happening on social media on the phone that you gave them? So we all bear responsibility for that. And we need to equip and discuss and help children figure out strategies, because bullying doesn't go away at elementary school, middle school, and high school. You get out into the work world, you got bullies there too. How are we going to manage those relationships? Finally, I'm going to share a few more resources with you, and then we are at the end. These are just some sort of electronic ones or virtual ones. So EarKick is an AI-based and it's customized. And what's interesting about it is that a kid can give the AI a scenario. And after a while, it learns the person's personality, and it is an AI they built. So, and then it gives them ways they can react that are healthy ways to react. It's really interesting. It's been written up in like Time magazine. And so if you wanted to try any pilot out with that. Cope Notes provides support by text, and they also have like group things for schools and universities. Mantherapy.org. So a lot of school counselors will say, okay, you don't want to talk to me, but you can take this online assessment at mantherapy.org. Well, let me tell you, the high school kids really like this because it says man therapy, and they are not considered a child, so they like that part. And then there is an Emerging Drug Trends podcast by Tall Cop Says Stop. So if you put in Tall Cop Says Stop podcast, you'll find Jerome's podcast. And then, of course, the resources, which I've already put in the chat as well. And I would love for you to add one thing in the chat that you learned today that you didn't know before. Lots of times after these, I kind of get, it's very emotional, right? It just helps kind of fill me back up and help me to understand why I do what I do. So I would really appreciate that. And I'm going to take a drink of water. Yes.
Can I ask a question that's in the Q&A right now too, please?
Mhm.
One of the people is asking what age you would recommend doing the short suicide screener.
Oh, you can do it. It's recommended at the age of 10, but you can do it as early as the age of 8. And that is from Dr. Lisa Horowitz from the National Institute of Mental Health, who actually was one of the researchers who put it together in the first place. I traveled the country with her promoting it for use in pediatricians' offices. So you can use it, children as young as 8 years old have struggled with thoughts of suicide. And if they don't know the word suicide, then you say, did you want to make yourself dead? You can ask it that way, because they don't always know what the word suicide means. And thank you for all the stuff in the chat. This is awesome. And that's just me at NC State. And that's my beautiful son. All of this is in memory of my son, Charles, who taught everyone around him what it meant to let another human being know that they mattered. And if anybody else has any other questions, that was a really good question. Oh, there's another in the Q&A. I'll let you, Kim, ask those.
Those have already been answered.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else have any other questions? Jamie said she just posted a new one. Jamie, did you post it in the Q&A?
Sorry, I maybe missed. I don't see it in there. Is it in the chat maybe?
No, in Q&A.
Oh, it's not showing in mine. Go ahead if somebody sees it.
Jamie said, I noticed that you say the method leaves no question when discussing suicide. I love this approach. Is this the approach you learned from experience, or is the language the community is moving to avoid ideas of ways to complete?
So I look at rules on following safety guidelines for doing these presentations. So I talk about his instrument of death. So I kind of made up those words, but they are based on safety guidelines. So thanks for that. And yes, because with this group, we don't want to talk about method. There is, there's stuff going on TikTok, like the Benadryl challenge. They can buy suicide kits online, and we don't want to talk about those in the news and on podcasts and big presentations, because guess what? That advertises them. Because this is a very susceptible population, as all of you know. I love all the comments. Thank you all for making the chat really lively and participating. I really appreciate that. I'm reading them now. Oh, thank you. Scromiting, yeah. And by the way, if they do start scromiting, I think it's a warm bath can actually bring down those symptoms. And if there's anything missing in the resources that I may have mentioned today but didn't put in there, you can reply to your auto message. It'll come to my email and I can send you a link to that. So don't hesitate to do that. I answer all my emails. And thank you all